I want to start with a scenario that is, well, it's deceptively simple.
Okay.
You're in your kitchen. Maybe
Yeah.
you're loading the dishwasher. Or maybe you're just grabbing a glass of water in the middle of the night.
Right.
And you drop a cup. Splash. Water goes everywhere on the tile. Maybe it seeps onto the edge of the carpet in the living room.
A classic everyday disaster.
Exactly. So you do what any responsible adult does. You grab a towel.
Uh-huh.
You get on your hands and knees. You soak it up. You press down hard.
Mm-hmm.
You touch the carpet, it feels dry. You touch the baseboard, it feels dry. You throw the towel in the wash and you think, disaster averted.
And that right there is the exact moment the clock starts ticking on a disaster you won't actually see for another 3 weeks.
See, that is the terrifying premise we are tackling today. Welcome to our deep dive into the source material, The Science of Invisible Damage.
Specifically, we're looking at episode 4, The Damage You Don't See.
Right. And our mission today is to really unpack this field of restoration science. Because, look, I consider myself a pretty observant person. If my roof is leaking, I know I have a problem.
Sure.
But the sources we're looking at today are arguing something much more unnerving. They're saying our basic definition of the word dry is fundamentally broken.
It is. It really is. And it's not just that your definition is wrong. It's that your biology, your actual human senses, are ill-equipped to deal with building science.
How so?
Well, we are wired to trust our senses. If I touch a surface and my nerves tell me there's no moisture, my brain concludes the material is dry.
Which makes sense logically.
It does, but in the world of restoration science, that conclusion is arguably the most dangerous one you can make.
That's a bold statement, calling it dangerous. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about a water spill here, not a gas leak.
Yeah, but the source material makes a distinction here that I think is crucial for you, the listener, to grasp. It talks about the difference between cleaning up and actual restoration.
Right, because most of us just clean up. We wipe the surface.
Exactly. But restoration science is about what's happening inside the materials themselves.
And to understand that, the source dives into the physics of the building materials. Because your house isn't built out of plastic sheets.
No, it's built out of sponges.
Sponges.
Think about it. Drywall, wood, insulation, concrete. These are all porous materials. They have a cellular structure that is designed, often completely inadvertently, to hold on to water.
So when I wipe that spill on my kitchen floor, I'm only dealing with what the source calls free water.
You're dealing with surface water, the free water.
Okay.
But the text introduces this concept of bound water, which is where the real trouble starts.
Bound water. Okay, explain that.
Well, think of it this way. If you dip a sponge in water and then you squeeze it out as hard as you physically can, it doesn't drip anymore, right?
It feels damp, maybe,
What?
but it's not soaking wet.
But is it dry? No. The water is now bound within the cellular structure of that sponge.
Okay.
And that is exactly what happens to your subfloor or your drywall. You wipe up the puddle, the free water, but the material itself has already absorbed moisture deep into its pores.
And here is the kicker from the text.
Yeah.
You cannot feel that moisture with your bare hand once it equalizes with the surface temperature.
You absolutely cannot.
Which brings us to that absolute hammer of a quote from the source. It says, "Dry to the touch does not mean dry by standard."
It's a great quote.
And the follow-up, which honestly I felt personally attacked by, it says, if you're drying by feel, you're guessing.
It sounds harsh, but it is entirely accurate. If you are drying by feel, you are essentially gambling with the structural integrity of your home.
Because you're just assuming the water stayed where you spilled it.
Right. You're betting that the laws of physics decided to take a break and the water just didn't migrate.
Let's talk about that migration. Because in my head, water follows gravity, it goes down.
Sure.
If I spill on the floor, the water goes down into the cracks. But the readings suggest it's way more complicated than just gravity pulling things down.
Much more complicated. I mean, gravity is just one force. But you also have to factor in capillary action.
Capillary action.
Yeah. This is the ability of a liquid to flow in narrow spaces without the assistance of, or even in direct opposition to, external forces like gravity.
So kind of like a paper towel dipping into a cup of water. You just touch the corner to the surface,
Yeah.
and the water literally climbs up the towel.
Precisely. Now take that paper towel image and replace it with your drywall.
Okay.
You have a leak on the floor, gravity pulls the water down, sure, but the gypsum in the drywall and that paper backing on the wall, they act exactly like a wick.
So the water climbs up the wall inside the wall cavity.
It does.
So I'm standing there staring at a baseboard that looks perfectly fine, feels dry, but 6 inches up inside the wall, the insulation's just sucking up water like a straw.
It is. And that creates what the source calls a vapor pressure differential.
Break that down for us.
So wet materials naturally have high vapor pressure. Dry materials have low vapor pressure.
Good.
And basic physics dictates that high pressure will always seek low pressure to find an equilibrium.
It wants to balance out.
Exactly. So that wet insulation isn't just sitting there minding its own business. It is actively trying to push its moisture into the dry studs, the dry sheathing, and the totally dry drywall on the other side of the room. It spreads.
It's relentless.
Oh,
It's actually seeking out the dry stuff to ruin it, too.
it's seeking equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
But in a typical house, equilibrium usually just means everything gets wet enough to start growing mold.
Okay, you said the M word. Mold.
Right.
We have to go there. Because the source material has this entire section on secondary damage.
Right.
And it outlines a timeline that is honestly kind of stressful to read. Because I think you, meaning the listener, me, most people assume mold takes weeks to show up.
Yeah, people think it's a slow process.
Like if I ignore a leak for a month, sure, I get mold. But the timeline in the source is way tighter than that.
It is surprisingly tight. Let's break down that timeline so you really understand the urgency here. You have the incident at hour 0, that's the spill. If you only address the surface, by hour 24, you are already seeing the beginning of secondary damage, even if you can't see it with your naked eye.
What's happening at hour 24?
Well, the drywall paper might start to swell or delaminate. The finish on your expensive hardwood floors might start to cup, meaning the edges raise up, because the bottom of the board is now wetter than the top.
Okay, so just 24 hours in, the house is physically changing shape slightly.
Right. But by hour 48 to 72, that is the danger zone.
Because of the spores.
Exactly. That is when mold spores, which, by the way, are everywhere. They are floating in the air in your house right now. They find that perfect combination of moisture, temperature, and a food source.
For food source being my house.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cellulose, paper, wood, dust. If the moisture content in that material is high enough, usually above 16 to 20%, depending on the specific species of wood or material,
Yeah.
those spores germinate.
And this leads to another key insight from the text. The quote is, most mold damage begins invisible. Explain that. Because when I think mold damage, I think of a big black fuzzy spot on the wall.
The black fuzzy spot is what scientists call the fruiting body. It's essentially the flower of the mold.
The flower. Okay.
By the time you actually see the flower, the roots, the hyphae, have been growing deep into the material for days, sometimes weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the colony is already fully established. The damage is largely done. And you know that musty smell you might notice before you see anything?
Yeah, the basement smell.
Right. Those are microbial volatile organic compounds, MVOCs.
Yeah.
That is literally the gas released by the mold as it digests your house.
That is such a gross way to put it. Digesting my house. But it paints a very vivid picture.
It's biological warfare on a microscopic scale. And the reason it's so insidious is that it happens behind the paint, under the carpet pad, inside the vanity cabinet.
Places you aren't looking?
Exactly. The touch test tells you the surface is fine. Meanwhile, a whole microscopic ecosystem is blooming 3 millimeters away in the dark.
So we've pretty solidly established that our hands are useless and our eyes are easily tricked. We're blind to the real problem.
Completely blind.
Which is where the source material pivots to restoration science as an actual discipline. It's not about guessing anymore. It's about data.
Data is everything.
They list a few tools, and I really want to dig into how they actually work, because I think people have seen these things on TV or whatever, but don't really get the science behind them. The first one they mention is thermal imaging.
Infrared thermography.
Yeah. Now, I've seen this in movies. You look through the camera, and the bad guy glowing in the dark is red or orange.
Right, Predator style.
Exactly. So in restoration, are we looking for glowing water? Does the water show up blue?
Not exactly. And this is a super common misconception. Thermal cameras do not actually see water.
Really?
No.
Yeah.
You can't just point it at a wall and say, oh, look, there's the water. What thermal cameras actually see is surface temperature.
Okay, but if the water is room temperature and the wall is room temperature, wouldn't they just look exactly the same on the camera?
You would think so, but you have to factor in evaporation.
Okay, how does that work?
When water evaporates from a surface, it consumes energy to change from a liquid to a gas. It takes heat with it.
Right.
This is known as evaporative cooling. It's the exact same reason your skin feels cold when you step out of a hot shower. The water evaporating is literally pulling heat energy out of your body.
Got it. So the wall is essentially sweating.
Exactly. Even if a wall looks completely dry to your eye, if there is moisture evaporating out of it, That specific spot will be slightly cooler than the surrounding completely dry area.
That makes total sense.
So on the thermal camera, it shows up as a cold anomaly, usually a dark blue or purple blob against a warmer orange or yellow background.
That is fascinating. So the camera is really just visualizing the physics of evaporation happening in real time.
It is. And the source is very, very careful to point this out. Thermal imaging is really just a roadmap. It is not definitive proof.
Wait, why not? If it's blue, it's cold, which means it's wet.
Right.
Right.
Not always. Think about it. A missing piece of fiberglass insulation inside the wall would also show up as a cold spot in the winter.
Oh, true.
A draft from a leaky window could look like a cold spot. A metal stud behind the drywall conducts heat differently than a wood stud, so that looks strange on the camera too.
Ah, so there are false positives.
Lots of them. If you just trust the camera implicitly, you might tear out a massive section of wall that was just a little cold.
So the camera tells you where to look, but it doesn't actually give you the final verdict.
Correct. For the verdict, you need the second tool the source talks about, the moisture meter.
And we're not talking about the cheap garden variety meter you stick in a potted plant, right?
No, we're talking about professional-grade hygrometers.
The source mentions two distinct types, non-invasive and penetrating. What's the difference there, and does it actually matter which one you use?
It matters immensely for an accurate diagnosis. A non-invasive meter uses radio frequency signals. It scans the density of the material beneath it.
So you don't have to break the wall.
Right, you just run the pad over the surface. It's great for quick scanning of large areas without damaging the paint or the floor, but again, metal pipes or other really dense materials hidden behind the wall can trick the radio frequency.
It sounds like everything has a margin of error if you use it alone.
That's why you eventually have to verify everything with the penetrating meter, the pin meter.
The pin meter. That sounds a bit more destructive.
It is slightly. You literally jam two metal pins into the wood or the drywall.
Okay.
And it runs an electrical current between those two pins. Now, water conducts electricity very well, right?
Right.
Wood does not. So the meter measures the electrical resistance between the pins. The less resistance there is, the wetter the material is.
And this is what gives you that hard data, the actual number.
Yes. It gives you a percentage of moisture content, or MC. And this is exactly where we move from the subjective, I think it's dry, to the objective, scientific, I know it's dry.
Let's talk about those numbers for a second, because the concept of dry is a relative term, isn't it? I mean, air always has some humidity. Wood has some water in it naturally just from existing.
Yes, everything is relative to the environment it's in. That's a huge key concept in restoration called the dry standard.
The dry standard.
Right. If I come into your house and stick a pin meter in your flooded hardwood floor and it reads 30%, I know it's wet.
Obviously.
But what is technically dry for that floor? Is it 0%? No, wood at 0% moisture would be so brittle it would crumble into dust under your feet.
So how do you actually know when you're done drying it? When is it safe to stop?
You have to find a baseline. You go to a room in the house that wasn't flooded, say the upstairs bedroom.
Okay.
You measure the identical wood floor up there. Let's say it reads 9% moisture content.
All right.
That 9% is your dry standard for that specific house on that specific day. That is the goal. You have to dry the flooded floor downstairs until it matches the unflooded floor upstairs.
That makes so much sense. You're not chasing some arbitrary universal number in a textbook. You're chasing equilibrium with the rest of the physical house.
Exactly. And until you hit that number, until you can prove with hard data that the wet material has returned to its dry standard, the restoration job is simply not done.
Which perfectly brings it to the final and probably most official part of this deep dive, the S500.
Ah, yeah.
The source material references this document like it's a holy text.
Yeah.
So what exactly is the S500?
In the professional restoration world, it essentially is the holy text. It stands for the ANSI-ICRC S500 Standard and Reference Guide for Professional Water Damage Restoration.
That is quite a mouthful.
It really is, but it's the defining document that separates, just a guy with a fan from an actual restoration professional.
Right.
The S500 dictates the actual science of drying. It doesn't just casually say dry the place out. It specifies the exact airflow calculation needed.
Airflow calculation.
Yes, it specifies the temperature ranges you need to maintain to promote maximum evaporation. It specifies the strict humidity control required.
Wait. Airflow calculation. You don't just, point a big fan at the wet spot and turn it on high.
If only it were that simple. Look, if you just point a fan at a wet wall, but you don't control the humidity in the room itself, you aren't actually drying anything.
What are you doing then?
You're just circulating wet air around the room. The S500 explains that you need to create a closed drying chamber.
A closed chamber, okay.
You need commercial dehumidifiers to aggressively pull the moisture out of the air, while the air mover, the fans, pull the moisture out of the wall and put it into the air. It's a completely balanced equation.
And what happens if you get that equation wrong? Say you use too many fans and not enough dehumidification.
If you get it wrong, you get secondary damage. You get the mold we talked about, or you get this phenomenon we call case hardening.
Case hardening?
Yeah, usually in wood framing.
That sounds like something that happens to a stale bagel on the counter. But applied to a floor joist, that's terrifying.
It is a classic amateur mistake. What happens is you dry the surface of the wood way too fast with high heat or too much direct air.
Okay.
And because you shocked it, the pores on the surface of the wood close up, they seal shut.
Oh no, so the water is trapped.
Exactly. The moisture gets trapped deep inside the core of the wood. It feels completely dry to the touch. There's that fallacy again, but it's literally rotting from the core out.
Wow. So the S500 is basically the instruction manual for avoiding all these invisible traps we've talked about today.
It is the standard of care. It protects the homeowner, but frankly, it protects the restorer from massive liability.
How so?
Because if black mold shows up in your walls 3 months later and you end up in court and you didn't document that you followed the S500 guidelines, you have absolutely no defense. You were just guessing.
It feels like the overarching theme here across all the excerpts we read is this necessary shift from basic human intuition to rigorous, measured science.
That's the core of it, yes.
We start with this very human, very intuitive reaction. Wipe the spill, feel the carpet. If it feels dry, forget about it.
Right.
But the reality of the porous materials we live in every single day requires us to ignore our intuition entirely and strictly look at the data.
That is the ultimate lesson. We live in biological, physical structures. They follow the strict laws of thermodynamics and biology, not our personal hopes and feelings.
Right.
You cannot negotiate with a fungal spore. You either create an environment where it physically cannot grow by removing the moisture according to standard, or you don't.
And removing the moisture means removing all of it, even the bound water you can't feel.
Especially the stuff you can't feel.
You know, this entire conversation has really changed how I look at my own house. I'm sitting here looking at the drywall now, just thinking, what are you hiding in there?
That is a very healthy paranoia to have after reading this material.
But it's somewhat empowering too, right? Because now we know, we, the listeners, know that dry to the touch is essentially a lie.
A dangerous.
We know that if we have a leak, we need to think about the timeline, that 24-hour, 48-hour window before secondary damage sets in.
Exactly.
And we definitely know that if we hire a professional and they show up to our house without a moisture meter or a thermal camera, we should probably just send them home.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If a restorer walks in and just uses the palm of their hand to check your carpet, you need to show them the door immediately.
Well, I want to leave everyone with a final thought to chew on today.
Go for it.
We've spent this entire deep dive obsessing over invisible water and invisible mold. We've proven that our primary senses, our touch and our sight, are pretty terrible at detecting actual safety hazards in our own homes.
You really are.
So if we can be so completely wrong about something as simple as whether a wall is wet or dry, what else in your environment are you assuming is safe, just because it looks fine?
That's a great point.
What other invisible mechanics are ticking away behind the scenes while you go about your day trusting your flawed senses?
That is exactly the kind of question that keeps building scientists up at night.
And now we can keep our listeners up at night, too. You're welcome, everyone.
Yeah, just go check under your kitchen sinks tonight.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you on the next one.